Welcome to Dr. K. Vasuki channel. In this video, we are going to discuss about errors in statistics. Here, we are going to discuss about types of errors in statistics and how to avoid it. An error does not become truth by reason of multiplied propagation, nor does a truth become error because nobody sees it. Who said? Mahatma Gandhi, our father of nation. What he said? An error does not become truth by reason of multiplied propagation. Finding multiple reason for accepting error as a truth. Like that, the truth become error because of nobody doesn't care about it. Nobody doesn't see it's a reality. That's what Mahatma Gandhi said. That is the things happening in a research. That's why we called as errors in statistics. For understanding of errors in statistics, first of all we have to have proper understanding about the concepts of level of significance, null hypothesis. In steps in testing the hypothesis, what is hypothesis? Hypothesis is the assumption. We are assuming something. We doesn't know whether it's true or not. So we are giving values to the variables which we decided to study. Based on the values, we are going to measure it, whether it has significance level or not. So here we are meaning that we are insisting that the significant level. Based on the level of significance only, we are going to accept hypothesis whether it is true or not. The level of significance plays vital role in testing the hypothesis. The definition of level of hypothesis is the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis in a statistical test when it's true. So probability means chance to occur of rejecting the null hypothesis in a statistical test when it is true. So null hypothesis, for any research we are stating null hypothesis. Always null hypothesis in the form of negative. For example, there is no relationship between rainfall and food production. That is called null hypothesis. But while we testing, null hypothesis has to be accepted. But we are rejecting the null hypothesis in a statistic test when it is true. That is called significant level. The level of significance in statistic is conventionally set to 0.05 to 0.01. The level of significance in statistics denotes the confidence level. We can say level of significance or confidence level of an investigator to accept or reject a null hypothesis in the statistical test. So based on the significant level, we are going to accept whether it is a true or we are going to reject because of it's not considered as a true. So a level of significance, that is we are setting 0.05 denotes 95% of confidence in the decision, because level of significance otherwise called confidence level, right? So whereas the level of significance 0.01 denotes 99% of confidence. So such a low level of significance is selected to reduce the erroneous rejection of a null hypothesis. Null hypothesis stated in the form of HO or H0. What is null hypothesis? Null hypothesis is a statement that one seeks to nullify with evidence to the contrary. In every research, we are assuming something and we are formulating the hypothesis as a research hypothesis. Null hypothesis is a statement. Of course, right? Null hypothesis is a statement. Null hypothesis is a statistical hypothesis which is going to be testable within the framework of probability. Right? Here, on the contrary to the research hypothesis, we are setting null hypothesis in the negative form. If we are setting there is a relationship between rainfall and food production, in the opposite we have to set there is no relationship between rainfall and food production. That is called null hypothesis. So, in the null hypothesis statement that one seeks to nullify with the evidence to the contrary. So, with evidence we are not going to accept anything. The null hypothesis is denoted as HO, or we can say H naught. Most commonly, the null hypothesis is the statement that the phenomena being studied produces no effect or make no difference, because we are setting statement itself there is no relationship. The null hypothesis always in negative form. Like that only we are setting there is no relationship between two variables. Like that. For example, a study to investigate the effect of urea on the size of leaf in the rice plant. So, here we are setting there is no relationship between the effect of urea on the size of leaf in rice plant. So, null hypothesis denoted as HO, urea does not have any effect on the leaf size of rice plant, because in the negative form itself we form the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is always constructed in a negative sense. The statistical tests only test the possible acceptance or rejection of the null hypothesis, because only possible acceptance of rejection of the null hypothesis. Why? Because in social science we do not find proportion that indicate a certainty. In the real world, we are studying about the social phenomena. Almost all the proportions generally indicate some sort of probabilities. So, we can say if A is true, B will be probability also be true. So, based on the probability, we accept or reject the null hypothesis. Okay. What is an alternative hypothesis? Definition of alternative hypothesis is a statement created in the negation of the null hypothesis. We are creating statement opposite to the null hypothesis. That means we are creating statement opposite to the null hypothesis. So, alternative hypothesis always in the positive form. There is relationship between two variables. So, it is contrary to the alternative hypothesis, because we may say alternative hypothesis as a research hypothesis, which is denoted by H1. Usually, the alternative hypothesis is a statement that the phenomena being studied produces some effect or makes some difference. This is a statement. Everything is a statement. Even null hypothesis is a statement. Alternative hypothesis is a statement about the social phenomena which we are going to study. And based on the test, we are producing some effect. So, based on the test, we are going to find out whether it has effect or make some difference. We are going to study to investigate the effect of urea on the size of leaf in rice plant. So, alternative hypothesis statement we used to be in negative format. alternative hypothesis denoted in the form of H1, that is urea have some effect on the leaf size of rice plant, because here we are mentioning that there is a relationship between urea and leaf size of a rice plant. Okay. So the alternative hypothesis is always constructed in a positive sense, whereas null hypothesis always constructed in a negative sense. If a statistical test rejects the null hypothesis, the investigator has to accept the alternative hypothesis. In null hypothesis, if a statistical test accept the null hypothesis, the investigator has to reject the alternative hypothesis. Here, we are going to discuss about what are our statistical errors. There are two situations in which the decision made on the information in the statistical come wrong, because they are called as the errors in statistics or statistical error. There are two types of statistical error. One is type 1 error, another one is type 2 error. What is type 1 error? If an H0 is true, that means null hypothesis is true, it should not be rejected by the statistical test, because in some conditions a researcher or investigator decided to reject the null hypothesis. He rejects the null hypothesis even though null hypothesis is true. It has to be tested with the statistical test. So that comes as type 1 error. Suppose an investigator made a decision to reject a true hypothesis, that is null hypothesis. He is committing an error that are called type 1 error. So researcher should not be biased. He has to take up the actual one. Suppose a researcher or investigator should be open-minded and has to accept test as it is. If null hypothesis is true, he has to reject the alternative hypothesis. But on the contrary, investigator make a decision that even though null hypothesis is true, he has to reject the null hypothesis, accepting the alternative hypothesis. It leads to type 1 error. So type 1 error is the wrong rejection of a true null hypothesis. The type 1 error is also referred as false positive, because it is positive, right? It is true, but we are rejecting. That's why we are calling false positive, because the type 1 error is detecting an effect that is not present. How to avoid it or reduce the type 1 error? The probability of committing type 1 error is specified by the level of significance. For testing anything, we have to form the level of significance. If a high level of significance is selected, 0.1, 0.2 in the statistical test, the probability of rejecting a null hypothesis increase, but it calls for rejecting the alternative hypothesis. This means that at a high significance level, the chance of committing the type 1 error is high. Thus, in order to avoid or reduce the type 1 error, a fairly low level of significance is selected, that is 0.05 or 0.01. If we select a 0.05, that confidence level is 95%. If we select a 0.01, constant level is 99%. So we have to have low level of significance. It reduce the type 1 error. What is type 2 error? If the HO, that is null hypothesis, is false, it should be rejected by the test of hypothesis. Right? If an investigator selects a significant level 0.5, 0.001 much lower than the conventional level, then the probability of rejecting a wrong null hypothesis reduces. So, it automatically leads investigator to commit a type 2 error. Type 2 error is the non-rejection of false null hypothesis, also known as a false negative. Okay, if null hypothesis is false, as a researcher we have to reject it, but we are accepting it. That is called type 2 error. That means type 2 error is the wrong acceptance of false null hypothesis. The type 2 error is also referred as false negative, because null hypothesis is a false, but we are accepting in the negative way. That's why we call it false negative, because the type 2 error is the failure to detect an effect that is actually present. So, as a researcher, we are failing to find out the actual effect on a particular phenomenon. So, how to avoid it or reduce it? If the null hypothesis in hypothesis testing is failed to be rejected, we have to reject when it should have been rejected. So, if we find out through the test whether null hypothesis is false, we have to reject it. We should not accept it. Lower level of significance increase the chance of type of 2 error in statistical test. So, lower level of significance increase the chance of type 2 error in statistic test. Thus, in order to avoid the type 2 error, very low level of significance should not be selected in the statistical test. Okay. So, type 1 error means the rejection of a true null hypothesis and accepting the alternative research. That leads to type 1 error. Type 2 error means non-rejection of false null hypothesis leads to type 2 error. The type 1 error, otherwise called false positive, type 2 error, otherwise called false negative.